Well, hello everybody. This is Tim Green with the Rattle Magazine. Welcome to the Critique of the Week for Friday, June 18th. Thanks so much for joining me. Always a pleasure doing these. Before I start, let me say that the point of the Critique of the Week is to share your opinions about poems and sit around like we would at a workshop and let the author know how we think and what we're feeling about the poem, where we respond, what's working, what's not. That kind of invaluable feedback from a stranger really helps both the poet who's got this poem going on in particular, but also everybody in the audience who gets to sort of articulate their feelings about poems and see what works and what doesn't for the sake of your own poems. You can use this kind of stuff too. So let's see. Now today's poet is right here. Turn that down a little bit, and let's go over to the document cam view. Today's poet is Nancy Sobanik, and she has two poems here. The first one, I think she wanted to do... I'll put the one that she'd put first, actually. So we tend to go longer on the first poem. And I tend to assume that the author wanted the first poem to be the poem that we focus on a little more. So this is Nancy Sobanik. Let me check over on her... It didn't have any general questions for us, but did send these two poems. Also didn't include any websites or links, but so let's just go do this. Sylvia had another side, and the other reason that we do these critiques is to give a little insight into what it's like to read a poem as a submission too. So this is another one of those instances where I have not looked at the poem at all ahead of time, so I'm going to sort of just talk about how I would read it if I was reading a submission, right? So. Sylvia had another side. As soon as I see Sylvia, I assume Sylvia Plath, because we're poets. We all talk about Sylvia. Sylvia Plath's kind of like the one poet you need to know. Like in the Trivial Pursuit, that board game, there's like one answer, one person you need to know in every category to be able to do Trivial Pursuit. Kind of the same thing with poetry and the word Sylvia. But let's see if it actually is Sylvia Plath. I don't know. Young women, so there you go, probably Sylvia Plath. Young women weep for beautiful madness, for cascades of words to rinse the stain believed indelible. In the depths shadows slant, guerrilla warfare against unbearable light and color, especially red, offensive to your eyes as blood, unwelcome tongues, childbirth as tulips. On the surface, pale, pale skin, still hands that float, detached like balloons, no string to hold tight. But like the rest of us, you cooked, sewed, held your children close, wrote letters tender and mercurial. What could not be spoken you wrote. Blessed were you when you saw the color, kaleidoscope shuddering image to image, black and white cut like a blade. But the color was you, a mosaic waiting to be joined, no missing pieces. These things unseen, these things that complete, leave their mark, make worthy, redeem, that whisper to the dark and rain, as well as wind and sun. One side does not cancel the other. Young women, do not weep. So that is the first poem for today, Sylvia Had Another Side by Nancy Sobanik. And let me see if we have people here. Paul Corbeil's here, and Louis Perch Valamir. Good to see France Smith. Nancy Kern Sebonic is here, and she says yes, it's Sylvia Plath. We'll try to ignore Nancy's comments until toward the end of the critique. But Caitlin Bucksbaum is over here on Facebook. She says not Emily Dixon. I mean, there's only one poet named Sylvia. If you're in a poetry space and the name Sylvia comes up, you can probably assume it's Sylvia Plath. I don't know. Are there any other poets? I can't think of any other poets whose name is Sylvia besides Plath. Anyway, so Sylvia has her side. Young women weep for beautiful madness. So the first thing I noticed, that this comma feels out of place. I'd probably cut that comma. Young women weep for beautiful madness. There's really no reason to break that there. For cascades of words, to rinse the stain believed indelible. Now, indelible is one of those words, I have to be honest and embarrass myself in public, but that's one of those words that I'd have trouble defining. What does it mean? Markings that cannot be removed. Yeah, so, okay. So, as in like an ink or a pen. So, an indelible person is something that can't be erased or eliminated. Yeah, it's one of those words, I had the sense of it, but I never actually, like if somebody asked me to define it, I would have trouble. Okay, so, to rinse the stain believed indelible. In the depths shadows slant, guerrilla warfare against unbearable color and light and color, especially red, offensive to your eyes as blood, unwelcome tongues, childbirth is tulips. So we're starting to get into the sort of the heart of the poem here in this second stanza. So we have young women weep for beautiful madness. And I think this is a good first line once you get rid of the comma, because it sort of sets the tone, and we end up with the address to young women later, which works well. So I was sort of, going along. I was on board for the first stanza. We get into the heart more in the second stanza, and we get a lot of abstraction here. So in the depths, shadows slant. In the depths of what? In the depths. So I'm trying to, where are we where there are depths? Guerrilla warfare against unbearable light and color. So I'm imagining maybe the depths of madness. And the depths of madness is it's not something you can visualize. And as we talk about on here all the time, we're such visual creatures. We want to create a space. Even if the poem is abstract and moving through unusual spaces that we can't really see, it's really hard to connect with a poem if we can't sort of start to get images flowing in our head that connect to something and feel grounded. And so the depths of madness, if that's what it is, there's no way to really visualize that, And when it gets to guerrilla warfare against unbearable light and color, there's too much light and color, so someone is fighting against the light and color in the depths of the madness, which makes sense, but it's something that's really hard to visualize and see and enter as a space. I hope that makes sense. So there's not a lot of connection there. It works on the page, you can tell what it's talking about, but there's not a lot of emotional connection with it yet, at least, because it's abstract in a way that you can't enter. You want to build a stage, even if things are weird on the stage, you want to build some kind of set that we can go into and live in someone else's shoes. And it's tough for me to do that with this. Colors are just so abstract. It's tough to do, especially red, offensive to our eyes as blood, unwelcome tongues, childbirth as tulips. So we're getting these sort of this collage of different things that are going on in these depths of the madness. But notice how the childbirth and tulips, they have such images associated with them, and tulips, of course, and childbirth's a little mini scene. You can start to feel a little bit there connected to it. On the surface, pale skin. On the surface of what? I guess on the surface of the madness again. So we're just sort of an extended personification of the madness, I guess, is what's going on here. So it's pale skin on the surface. All this color, this unbearable light and color going on underneath. Still hands that float detached like balloons, no string to hold tight. But, like the rest of us, you cooked, sewed, held your children close. So this is what I wanted to point out too. We get the you all of a sudden here. I don't think the you appears early. Oh, your eyes. Offensive to your eyes, which I kind of passed over without noticing. But here, like the rest of us, you cooked. You cooked, you sewed. So all of a sudden, we didn't get that in the beginning. Young women weep for beautiful madness. I think this poem, it would be strengthened if you just let us know that you're addressing the you as Sylvia earlier. So for your beautiful madness up here, and then make the whole thing feel like you're talking. And we love intimacy in poems, and so if you can make it feel like you're talking to Sylvia here as you are later, the whole poem feels more intimate and more connected too. So get the your in there, and as you write, think of it as making that direct address, and then it'll feel a little closer. But really, I think at this part, offensive to your eyes, because the poem was more. It hadn't introduced the idea that it was talking to Sylvia yet. I imagine it was how madness feels for all. It was talking to all people who experience this. The you general, you all. Your eyes in that sense. And so when we get here, it ends up being Sylvia, in a direct address. So it changes, and there's no reason to hide that till later. So I'll get the you up at the top. But like the rest of us, you cooked, sewed, held your children close, wrote letters, tender and mercurial. What could not be spoken, you wrote. I think that's a really good line. I like that line. And feel how, too, once we get this direct address to the Sylvia, you start to feel a little more connected to it, too. And the cooked and sewed are things we can imagine, so we start to get a little bit of a sense of our place in the space here. And the writing letters, and then the what could not be spoken, you wrote. That's a very nice, simple line. A lot of times the best lines in a poem are really simple, and that's the case here. Blessed were you when you saw the color, kaleidoscope, shuddering image to image, black and white cut like a blade. See this, so we get back to this color stuff, and it's just, it's too, I don't know what to say. It's too detached. Like the idea, like using color as a metaphor just doesn't have a lot of like connection with it. Like I was saying it earlier, and we get back into this. So it feels like vague in its abstraction, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like if you paint the scene and let us move in, we'll be connected more to it. But having a kaleidoscope of colors, while you can sort of imagine that, it's in a detached way, if that makes sense. Black and white cut like a blade, but the color was you, a mosaic waiting to be joined, no missing pieces. So we have this sort of kaleidoscope pattern of color going on. And again, it's just hard to feel an emotional connection to that because it's such an abstract visual, even though it is a visual. These things inside, unseen, these things that complete, leave their mark, make worthy, redeem. I like the rhythm in that sentence, in those couple lines. I like that. That whisper to the dark and rain, as well as wind and sun, one side does not cancel the other. Young women, do not weep. And so here, this is what I was about to talk about before. So that when the poem felt like a direct address to Sylvia, we felt connected. And here we get a very last line. We get a direct address to young women. So it changes who it's speaking to. And it's an interesting thing to try to do. But it comes out in sort of a, I don't know, more could be done with it, I guess I could say. So if you want to make that transition, like do more with it, or just don't do it at all, or pick one. Are we addressing the young women, or are we addressing Sylvia? Like address who you're going to address, and then it feels more intimate and connected because we get to sort of see inside this discussion, kind of this intimacy, So I don't know. I wonder what people thought about that shift at the end, with when it shifts to young women do not weep. So that's my general opinion about the poem. When we get to see, these details, even though they're slight details, we get to feel like we're connected to a little bit more than these colors and the mosaic and the kaleidoscope, which are too abstract to really connect with. So focusing on these kind of details and not these kind of details, I think is the way to go more with this poem, and figuring out who you want to address, and either sticking with it with one or the other, or being very careful about that transition and like capitalizing on the surprise of it changing. So those are let me see what people are saying on, let's see. Jenny Middleton says, I like the references to Plath's poems that are woven well into the poem. Fran Smith says, MidSummer Madness. MidSummer Madness. Is that a Plath poem? I'm not sure. I love the inclusion of Unwelcome Tongues as concrete descriptions of red. Yeah, I was going to point that out. Thanks I kind of passed it over, but I like that. That's a good line too. The Unwelcome Tongues. I mean, the idea that they're unwelcomed, it says a lot in it symbolically. And tongues are something too. It's concrete, and we get a very strong image of. Elizabeth Johnson Amber says, I'm imagining Ophelia floating in the weeds. See, so if there was Ophelia floating in the weeds, that'd be a great image, and that's something good to include in a poem. Sylvia Plath's poem Tulips describes the intense reaction to the color red. Let's look at tulips. I was wondering, it might be a good comparison. So this is from the Poetry Foundation. And let's see the difference. This poem is reaction to color. And Plath does use color frequently. But watch how concrete she's going to be doing this. And I don't know if we should read the whole poem, but we'll show some of it at least. I got to switch to the screen view, and then so bear with me for 1 second. Find the right window. It wasn't set up for this. There we go. Okay, so this is Tulips by Sylvia Plath. The tulips are excitable. It is winter here. Look how white everything is. How quiet. How snowed in. So already in the first 2 lines, we get look how white everything is, which is an abstraction based on color, but we are also snowed in, and we also know it's winter here. So we get these concrete details. I am learning peacefulness, lying by myself quietly as the light lies on these white walls. See, we get white walls. So we know where we are, this bed, these hands. So even though there's abstraction through the color, we're placed within the poem. We're seeing a scene. And I mean, there are ways to do a poem without it, but it's very hard, and most successful poems find a way to draw you in like that through the mind's eye, and have that as an element. I am nobody. I have nothing to do with with explosions. I have given my name and my day clothes up to the nurses, and my history to the anesthetist, and my body to surgeons. So now we know more about the scene, but it's still this scene, right? They have propped my head between the pillow and the sheet. So we're totally in the scene where I think it's the childbirth, right, that's going on. I'm getting like emergency alerts meanwhile. Okay. The nurse, stupid people, it has to take everything in. Let me try to get to where there's more red. But see how much of a concrete scene we get. My body is a pebble to them. They tend it as water. And so since we know where we are in this poem, when we get to my body as a pebble to them, that's an abstract kind of metaphor, but we feel it because we're already connected to the poem. We're already like in the space of the poem. The universe that the poem has created has actually been created. I was just reading to my son the Chronicles of Narnia. And in the beginning of the Chronicles of Narnia, and I think it's the first book, Aslan is like making Narnia in one scene toward the end. And you sort of get the universe, you watch the universe be created like element by element, in the same way with Genesis, because it's a religious kind of young adult book. But you see the way the world is built, like image by image, and it becomes a world. And that's kind of what a poem is like read that chapter where Aslan is making Narnia in the Chronicles of Narnia. And that's what a poem is really doing. So anyway, let me keep going and find the red. Let's see. I've let things slip. A 30-year-old cargo. It gets to red later, doesn't it? I didn't want any flowers. I only wanted to lie. The tulips. There it is. The tulips are too red in the first place. They hurt me. Even though, but see, since we already know the scene and what's going on, the fact that we know we know where to place the idea of too red. And how they hurt me, like the whole, like it's the scene that's making the emotion, not the red itself. If that makes sense. Lightly through their white waddling, so we get these more colors. Their redness, like an awful baby, their redness talks to my wound. It corresponds. They are subtle. So I think you get the idea here. Go to Poetry Foundation. This is Sylvia Plath, Tulips, and you can read the whole poem here. We won't go through it all, but feel how concrete this is. And then let's go back to the poem we're looking at. And here on the surface, pale skin. So we don't know. We get this idea, the setup, where there's the beautiful madness, and you sort of can imagine like some kind of like underneath the skin, or like layers of something. There's these colors underneath that only appear white on the surface, which is an interesting idea, but it's sort of, feel how that like floats in a universe that doesn't really exist yet. And so that's what's missing from this poem, is the universe that lets us feel like it's a part of it, that creation from Narnia or whatever. Anyway, let me look at some more comments here. Elizabeth Johnson Amber says, I wonder if the abstraction could happen in the beginning and then quickly shift to the concrete, since the point seems to be really see her not in the abstract. Yeah, you can shift around with this. You know, one of the concepts that I've heard people talk about, I can't remember which professors or whatever, is the idea of having touchstones in a poem. That like you can, like if you're underwater, cave diving or cave spelunking, or not spelunking, but when you're swimming in a cave, it's really important. It's really, really dangerous, but it's really important to have a guide rope to know where like the surface is that you can go back to, because if you get lost and run out of air, you die. And a poem is kind of like that too. Like you need a way, like you can go as far as you want, kind of as long as there's still that rope you can hold on to that touches back to the surface. And so as long as you sort of keep that connection to, in the Plath's case with Tulips, into the hospital room setting, and this poem would be something else. Maybe just the setting here where Plath is cooking and sewing and things like that. As long as you're sort of in connection with that, you can go as far as you want, as long as you sort of stay tethered. Keep a touchstone that you can sort of hold on, so you know your space, so you know which way is up and which way is down. And that's kind of the way to move through a poem. So let's see. Sharon Ferrante says, came late, can't follow. I should mention always, if you can rewind, especially on YouTube. I'm not sure on Facebook. I don't really watch live streamed Facebook videos, but on YouTube, you can just go back with a little bar, even though it's live, and start from the beginning if you come late. See, Mark A. Grinier says, blessed makes this sound like a prayer to the Virgin Mary. The idea that there are two sides to the Plath story, death and suicide and motherhood and life, is an interesting one. Well imaged overall. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Mark. I meant to say that early, that the idea of Plath having another side, and not just being the beautiful madness, but a real life, and not this sort of figure for young weeping women, as it says in the beginning, is an important poem to write. And I think you can feel what compelled the poem to be written. So I'd like to see maybe more, like we were saying, more of a touchstone be Plath in her real life here, and then go out into the abstraction. Like you could imagine if this poem were describing Plath going through the cooking and sewing, and you had an image of this domesticity where the real Plath was there, and then these colors were like beneath the surface of her skin in that room, and that was the way that the metaphor operated. You could see that really working, and it'd be a really good poem to be writing about. So I think that would work well. Okay. Stephanie Striffler says, red especially offends your eyes like blood, unwelcome tongues, childbirth, tulips. Yeah, I wonder, is the Unwelcome Tongues from a Plath poem? That's a reference I didn't get. But yeah, that'd be a good way to start out the poem, and then move in and out of the actual scene. Let's see. So over here, Terry R. mentioned the Tulips poem. Thanks to Terry. I saw the other one first, but thank you for writing it over there. Warren Dvornik says, I was also confused by the identity of you throughout the poem. Maybe make young women do not weep its own stanza to emphasize the change in the addressee. So when I was mentioning the shift in the you, where suddenly the what would you call it? The implied you here shifts from Plath to the young women. You could really capitalize on that. And what I meant was making it its own, like, maybe not stanza, but maybe stanza, but drawing that out like young women, and like shift and then move to the reader or something like that is the person you're addressing, and then describe that a little bit. So you get a whole like chunk, where the shift is actually something that has more substance to it than just a sudden shift. So you could imagine like this poem where we're describing Plath being a real person and not just this archetype that we see her as sometimes. And then describing what's going on beneath her skin using this kaleidoscope imagery. And then when we get to the young woman, just for example, young women do not weep like your skin too as you hold this book, that kind of thing. And then describe a little bit about what's going on to the you you're talking to here as it shifts. And that could be a way to make something interesting go on in this poem. But Warren also says, or move the last line altogether. Yeah, I mean, there's a million ways to write a poem. You kind of have to just play with them until you figure out the most powerful way to do it. So that would be, as I mentioned, like talking to Plath the whole way through, so we get that intimacy. Talking to the young women the whole way through, so we get that intimacy, or capitalizing on the shift and making it separate poems. Those are 3 routes you go. They could all work. There's just a million ways to write a poem. But it's interesting subject matter. So let's see. So we've gone on for 20 minutes on this poem. John Riley says this poem makes it clear how hard it is to take flight the way Plath did in her final poems. Yeah, great point, John. That was John Riley. Okay. And Elizabeth Johnson likes this idea. Yeah. Okay. So I think we sort of push this poem as far as we can for now. Let's do this other one. This is Not Enough Evidence. And again, we like to do 2 poems if possible, because then you can see if there are patterns and just the way a poem happened to go, or if there's general tendencies and things like that. And we can, help with 2 things. So it's good to look at 2. You can see you need 2 points to make a line, or a curve. Not enough evidence. Daybreak rises draped in pastel stalks. Across the cold and hard earth below, hoarfrost glitters. Strands of diamonds scatter across root arms. Hidden in the departing shadows, a singular cry pierces the air. Soon a ruckus of jays will sound as a red flower blooms. For now, the florist contracts in stillness. In the urban park, a boy plays in the snow, tall for his age, with skin the color of cocoa. He flourishes a toy gun. A car pulls up, lights flashing, with a demand to raise his hands. A deafening noise pierces the air. Jeez. And the toy falls to the ground. The horizon is cleaved as light drains into black. Soon cries from mother and sister will rend the air. A red flower blooms on the cold, hard concrete. For now, the world stands by in silence. And that was in memory of Tamir Rice. So you could see the scene of the murder of Tamir Rice being played out there. Not enough evidence. So this is sort of a response kind of poem to events. Not enough evidence. There's how that plays in is a title. Man, I'm mumbly today. It is a title that plays into, adds something. You can look back and, sometimes it's interesting to read through a poem, and then when you look back at what the title was, to sort of have that, it's like an extra click of recognition that you can sort of get. And sometimes you can exploit that and get more out of the poem when the title makes more sense after you read the whole poem. And then sort of like, the way a last line can click and be a little bit of an epiphany, just looking back up at the title, which pretty much everybody does, I think, when they read a poem. That can be a sort of a second opportunity for that experience. And I think that works a little bit here. So I like that title. Daybreak rises, draped in pastel silk. So again, we get colors a lot. Daybreak rises, draped in pastel silks. It's an interesting image, but at least we get the grounding here that daybreak comes. Across the cold and hard earth below, hoarfrost glitters, strands of diamonds scattered across root arms. So we get a scene here in a way that we didn't really get with the other poem. It's still colorful and abstract, but we get sort of a sense of the camera, as we move through this universe that exists within the poem. Like the beginning of certain movies start like way out with a panoramic scene of the landscape. That's kind of the start here. Hidden in the departing shadows, a singular cry pierces the air. Now, having a cry pierce the air is a bit of a cliche. I also wondered, too, given that we know what the context is coming up, does this landscape that we're seeing like fit with it? This is like an urban park, right? And so was it winter? I think it was March. Was it cold enough for this? I don't know. I'm seeing like a cold, icy landscape, not a lot of like city type stuff, so maybe the overhead view is a little off. But it's still interesting. But I wouldn't do the pierces the air. That is a cliche. You don't want anything to pierce the air, especially a singular cry. this sort of like a dramatic cliche. Soon a ruckus of jays will sound. I like ruckus of jays. As the red flower blooms. For now, the forest contracts in stillness. So we get a forest here too. Maybe I'm just misremembering the setting for Tamir Rice's killing. The police car pulls up. There's like on a sidewalk, kind of, right? And urban park there. So is there really is there a forest there? I'm having trouble placing that, how that fits. In an urban park, a boy plays in the snow, tall for his age, with skin the color of cocoa. I don't know. The color of cocoa feels like trying to describe race without describing race, which feels kind of like a cop-out or something. I would just describe the skin color a little bit more directly. He flourishes a toy gun. A car pulls up, lights flashing with a demand to raise his hands. A deafening noise, again, we have the same thing, pierces the air like the cry did. So a cliche referring back to a cliche. So we got to get rid of that. The toy falls to the ground. The horizon is cleaved as light drains into black. So we do get this whole scene playing through the movie, and feel how even it's a scene we've seen before, and it's there's some cliches here. But we still feel a little more connected to this poem just because there's a scene than we do to the other poem where it's hard to place. And that's the power of having a scene within a universe to being the way a poem is sort of laid out. And since we have this whole, even though it feels a strange sort of description of the landscape, because we have this landscape here described above, we have the whole sort of sense of this scene. Then something as abstract as the horizon is cleaved as light drains into black can have a lot of meaning. And I like that drains into black too, because of course the life is draining out into the darkness of death, and that's a powerful way to say that. Soon cries from a mother and sister will rend the air. That's sort of in the same vein as piercing the air. A red flower blooms on the cold, hard concrete. For now, the world stands by in silence. So this is one of those poems where the scene is played out really well. I was just last night talking to what's her name? Tashani Doshi, and about narrative in poetry, and it's for an interview in this fall issue, and she was talking about how it's sort of a trap to just tell a story, and that's kind of what this does too. Like a poem needs to be exploring the mystery of like why you're drawn to the story, and not just telling the story. And so the question is like, why did I want to write this? Like, what did me as a poet find compelling about this story that made me want to write this? You right? And that's really what is behind, kind of, you can say, all poetry. Like a poem is something where there's this mystery feeling we can't really get a grasp of, and we want to explore it and figure out like why it's like gnawing at us. And we never get the sense of why it is gnawing at us, or why it was gnawing at the poet. Like what connection is my conscious mind not making that my subconscious knows? And how do we find that? And that's what a poem mostly does. That's what my art mostly does. And so here we get the story, but not the why. And but see how when the scene pulls through, we enter the scene and feel engaged as it goes through, because that's drama, and that's how drama pulls you in. Even though we know what's going to happen, So in a weird way, I think if you could combine the styles of both of these two poems into one poem, that's where, so they're each sort of missing opposite elements. Let's see, but let me see what the comments. So Sharon Ferrante says, a singular cry of a ruckus of jays as flowers bloom. The color red here, this is Mark Grinier, the color red here is flowers and blood. Oh, he's talking about the last poem still. Or maybe he's not. The color red. Oh, yeah, he's talking about this poem. The color red here is flowers and blood. The flowers blooming foreshadow the blood flowing. The jays are like a flurry of cries against the killing. The ultimate sense is that in the instant of death, strong feelings exist, but they are too soon forgotten. The world stands by in silence. Yeah, I mean, that's an explanation of the poem. And yeah, thanks for pointing that too. I should have mentioned that the red flower is the blood, and in here this was foreshadowed. But it's telling the story and not getting at the mystery of the story, like what the story means, why this poem is being written. Marky Gunner says the question is, after these killings, is there enough evidence to require real action? Is that played out in this poem? I mean, that was something I was going to get back to. Not enough evidence is the title. Not enough evidence for what is the sort of a question that the poem asks, which is interesting. Because it doesn't seem to be legal to me, actually, when you read the title. And that kind of question of is there enough evidence isn't really asked or addressed in the poem. Something else is. So enough what? Or enough evidence of what is something that's interesting there, and maybe that being explored, of really what is being talked about here is kind of the why that's missing, maybe, and I don't feel like it's been explored enough. So the poem is sort of still hanging in this limbo where it hasn't like attacked its target yet, or something like that. Let's see. I'm going to go over to YouTube. Sally D says, I agree the setting should be more urban. Yeah, I mean, and, daybreak rising in a more urban setting. I'm not sure, I would have to look up more details about the case of Tamir Rice. I don't even know, was it in Columbus, Ohio? Let's see, I'll just look it up. I was in Cleveland. Okay, so let me look at the actual. So it was Cudell Recreation Center. So as a poet, you can. One of the wonderful things about the world is that you can go on the internet and actually find the place, and so this is actually here. On Google Street View, you can drop in, and it would have been somewhere around. I'm not sure which corner it was, but like we're here, right? It might have been over here. I'm not really sure exactly, but you can imagine daybreak rising through this landscape, and what would it look like? In cold hard earth with hoarfrost and root arms. There are trees, so there would be root arms, but that doesn't really feel like you're in that place, So there's a lot of opportunity to describe daybreak coming through this area, but it doesn't feel like the poem is situated in this area. So that's one opportunity to make more of the poem. And okay. Is there anything else? Let me see if there are any other comments left. Sharon Francis suggests daybreak draped across cold, hard earth. Fran Smith says, I think I would include blue light, bring in more color reference. That could work. Jen Riley says the poem doesn't start until stanza 3. And that's a good point, too. I mean, this is sort of a picture frame around the poem. And the poem really gets going here. In an urban park, a boy plays in the snow, which is a good first line. He flourishes a toy gun, blah, blah, blah. So we get the scene. I don't know. But with this poem, I want to know, why. I want to discover. I feel like every poem is the discovery of why it was written. That's sort of the process of what a poem is. And I feel like I don't know why it was written by the end of it. So this poem is just one that has more exploring to do. I think it's a good start. The other one we know why it was written, which is interesting. So we get that element. We just don't connect to it as much as we could. But this one we haven't gotten to the why yet. And so push until you realize, have some kind of discovery, some kind of transformation that explains why you were doing why the poem exists. Let's see. Elizabeth Johnson Ambrose says, I wonder, thinking more about the poet's connection to the poem, if someone's claim that there wasn't enough evidence to convict is what inspired the poem. And if that can be explored, the gut punch of the images might work better then. Yeah, good point. And she also says these are the evidences the poet wants to provide, or the post wants to provide. Or poet, yeah, what the poet wants to provide. Yeah, I mean, maybe it just doesn't feel like it's explored. Like there was a reason this poem was compelled in the writer, and why. If it is about just the physical evidence and the legal issue and whether or not there was enough evidence, then explore that in the poem. I feel like that's evidence of something else, though. I think there's like a broader, the poem opens up with this scene. I feel like there's a broader thing that it's actually exploring than just like the legal situation. I think evidence means something different, but I don't know exactly what. There's sort of a sense of it, of like the world standing by in silence. Evidence of what? Well, like, what does that mean? The silence, not the actual death. If that makes sense. But there's something more here. So I would say to just push and play with this poem more until it figures out what it's actually trying to say. Okay. So Francis finds all very interesting. I learn a lot through poetry. I'm thinking the red and white is blood, and the washing white is snow. The impurities and darkness, perhaps, in both poems. Yeah, both poems come from color a lot. John Riley says about this. He's the one who said the poem starts here at the third stanza. He says, I see what was intended with the first two, but maybe the gap between the first two stanzas and the last two stanzas is too wide. That's a good way to put it. That's interesting. Let's see. Any other comments here? Over on YouTube, D. Coleman says, I like the juxtaposition of nature in an urban park setting with the violence of what happened. Interesting. And Warren Dvornik says the punctuation is a bit inconsistent. Let's see. Yeah, it's very casual. And that's something, who was I talking to? God, I'm so bad with names. Lance Larson. Lance Larson was the guest in the Rattlecast last week. And I meant to ask about something, and it never kind of came up. We got into different directions. But he moved in and out of punctuation a lot, in a way that works weirdly. I wanted to talk to him about that. Like, he'll have like poems where there should be list commas, and there aren't, but then there are regular punctuation elsewhere. And he'll just sort of freely move between things. And in a way that it feels intentional. So you wouldn't want to correct it. Like, as an editor, you're like, this is what he's trying to do on purpose. It's adding something and it feels intentional. Here, let's see, because I did notice it too. Let's see, hidden in the depths of shadows, a singular cry pierces the air. Yeah, here was a place right there. Is that a period that should be there? Soon a ruckus of jays will sound as red flower blooms. For now, the forest. Yeah, and again here. So there's places where there should be punctuation and there's not. But then we get a capital. So I don't know. So to me, instead of like how it was with Lance, where you could tell that it was intentional, he wanted like the rhythm of the poem to be matching that and doing something different there. Here, it feels like it's just missing because we get the capital and, in other places we get the end stops. So it is inconsistent. He's right. Whoever it was, D. Coleman, who said that. Terry R. said about Tamir Rice, I assume, there are deeply disturbing details about the way this came down to be found on the internet. So everybody can look into that more if you're interested. Is there any other comments? Let's see. I think that might be as much as we can say about these two poems now. Mark Grinier again says, part of the impact of this poem is the fact that similar situations occur far too often. We as a society must respond effectively. And yeah, that's what I'm getting at here. Like somehow it's the silence, and the silence is the evidence, of what's really being talked about in the poem, which is not just the evidence in the case. It's something more, but it's just not explored, I don't think. And that's what needs to be explored more in the poem. Okay. Well, I think that is it for the critique of the week today. Thanks so much to Nancy, who is here. I saw Nancy leave a comment earlier. Thanks so much, Nancy, for sharing these poems and letting us go through them. It's a lot of fun. I love digging into poems and seeing how they tick and things. And hopefully this critique was helpful. Before I go, let me just say that next week on the Rattlecast, the guest, actually not that next week, this weekend, the guest in the Rattlecast is going to be Win Cooper. And that's going to be the early time because he has to leave out at night, so couldn't make the nighttime broadcast. So we're doing an early show this week for Rattlecast number 98 with Win Cooper, Sunday, June 20th at noon Eastern time. Let me look up the prompt for the week if you want to spend your Saturday or Friday night writing a poem. The prompt for this week was to... macrophotography is the close-up, highly detailed photography of small objects or organisms. Common subjects include an insect's wing or a blade of grass. Write a macro poem. And how you interpret macro poem can be any way you want, so it could be like an ekphrastic poem of a macro image, or it could be some way of looking in detail at a subject, like far closer than you would. I mean, there's a lot of ways you can explore. I don't know if that's a genre of the macro poem is something that's addressed or something Megan just made up when she made this prompt. So it'll be really interesting to see what people come up with for this prompt this week. But that is the prompt for this week's Open Lines after we talked to Win Cooper. And I didn't mention Win Cooper is just a really wonderful poet. I love his book, Postcards from the Interior. He's most famous for his poem Fun being used by Sheryl Crow, that all I want to do is have some fun. So he still gets royalties from that. It's one of the most listened to poems in the history of the world because of that song. And so we'll talk to him about that for sure. His newest book is Mars Poetica. And that'll be Rattlecast number 98, Sunday, June 20th, noon Eastern time. See you then. Hope you have a great rest of your weekend. Until then, talk to you later. Bye.